Hello there. Welcome to Soft History, a place where the past unfolds gently, where forgotten voices rise like whispers carried across water, and where history becomes not a collection of dates and facts, but a living, breathing story about people who once walked this earth just as you and I do now. Tonight, we step aboard a ship that has haunted the collective memory of humanity for more than a century. Not because of the steel and rivets that formed its hull, not because of the luxury that lined its corridors, but because of the lives that filled its decks, the laughter, the dreams, the quiet conversations, the heartbeats that echoed through its passageways during a voyage that would become one of history's most profound reminders of our shared fragility. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Is it morning or night where you are? Are you listening while working, relaxing, or drifting off to sleep? Share in the comments. It's always wonderful to hear from you. Now, back to our journey. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Atlantic Ocean in April of 1912. Dark and vast and impossibly cold, stretching endlessly beneath a sky so clear that the stars seem close enough to touch. Somewhere on that black expanse of water, a single ship moves through the night, its lights glowing like a small constellation adrift on the surface of an indifferent sea. From a distance it appears almost serene, this floating palace of iron and ambition, carrying within its walls more than 2,000 souls, each with a name, a story, a reason for being there, a dream tucked carefully inside the luggage they brought aboard. If you could step back through time and walk those decks in the days before everything changed, you would not see a tragedy unfolding. You would see life in all its ordinary, beautiful complexity. Families sharing meals, children racing through corridors, lovers standing at the railings watching the horizon, workers tending engines deep below, musicians tuning their instruments, letters being written by candlelight, prayers whispered in languages from across the world. This is not a story about a shipwreck, though a shipwreck lives within it. This is a story about people, about the intricate web of circumstances and choices and hopes and fears that brought them all together in one place at one moment in time. It is about the millionaire who boarded seeking comfort and the immigrant who boarded seeking survival, about the newlywed couple beginning their future and the elderly woman visiting family one last time, about the coal stoker far below deck and the violinist playing in the grand saloon, about the child clutching a doll and the captain standing on the bridge. Each of them carried something precious onto that ship, not just their belongings, but their humanity, their essence, the invisible weight of every experience that had shaped them into who they were. And for a few brief days in April, they all existed together in a strange temporary community, a floating world suspended between the old life they had left behind and the new one waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Tonight, we will walk among them. We will read their letters, hear their voices, follow their footsteps from the moment they decided to book passage on the RMS Titanic to the final hours when the stars shone cold and bright above an ocean that would forever change from a pathway to a graveyard. We will explore not just what happened, but who they were, the real people behind the legend, the beating hearts beneath the historical narrative. And perhaps, in learning their stories, we will understand something essential about ourselves, about the threads that connect us all across time and circumstance, about the preciousness of ordinary moments and the courage that lives quietly in the human spirit. So settle in, dear listener. Let the world around you fade. We are going back now, back to a time when the 20th century was still young and full of promise, back to a spring morning when a ship prepared to sail, back to the gangways where footsteps echoed and voices called out in excitement and anticipation, back to the beginning of a voyage that has never truly ended, because it lives on in memory, in story, in the echoes that ripple forward through generations. The RMS Titanic awaits, and so do the people who made it more than just a ship. They made it a mirror in which humanity could see itself reflected, in all its beauty and all its sorrow. The world in 1912 was a place caught between eras, suspended in that strange electric moment when the past has not quite released its grip and the future has not yet fully arrived. If you had walked the streets of London or the New York or Paris in those early months of the year, you would have felt it in the air, the sense of transformation, of acceleration, of barriers dissolving, and new possibilities emerging like flowers pushing through late winter snow. The Victorian age, with all its rigid formality and elaborate social codes, was fading into memory, making way for something modern, something faster, something that promised to reshape the very texture of daily existence. Motorcars were beginning to compete with horse-drawn carriages on city streets, their mechanical roar a herald of the industrial future. Electric lights were replacing gas lamps, turning night into an extension of day. Telephones allowed voices to travel across impossible distances, collapsing space in ways that would have seemed like magic just a generation before. But beneath all this gleaming progress, older rhythms persisted. Most people still lived lives that would have been recognizable to their grandparents, rising with the sun, working with their hands, moving through seasons and traditions that stretched back centuries. In the countryside, farmers still followed the ancient patterns of planting and harvest. In small towns, church bells still marked the passage of time. In immigrant neighborhoods crowded into the growing cities, families maintained the languages and customs of distant homelands, creating little islands of familiarity in an increasingly unfamiliar world. The year 1912 was a threshold, a doorway through which humanity was passing without quite understanding what lay on the other side. There was optimism, certainly, a widespread belief that technology and industry would solve age-old problems, that the future would be cleaner, safer, more prosperous than anything that had come before. But there was also anxiety, a quiet unease about the pace of change, about what might be lost in the rush toward progress. In Europe, the great empires that had shaped the world for centuries were beginning to show cracks in their foundations, though few recognized the signs of what was coming. In just 2 years, the continent would plunge into a war so devastating that it would shatter the old order entirely. But in 1912, that catastrophe was still unimaginable, hidden in a future that seemed bright with promise rather than dark with approaching shadow. People dreamed differently then, with a particular kind of hope that comes from believing that the trajectory of history moves inevitably upward, that each generation will live better than the one before. America especially glowed in the collective imagination as a land where the old hierarchies of birth and class might be escaped, where a person could reinvent themselves, where hard work might actually lead to prosperity rather than just survival. Millions had already made the journey across the Atlantic, sending letters home that painted pictures of a place where the streets might not be paved with gold, but where opportunity felt real and tangible in a way it never had in the villages and cities they had left behind. This was the context in which the RMS Titanic was built, not just as a ship, but as a symbol of everything the age believed about itself. It represented the triumph of human ingenuity over nature, the ability to create something so large and so complex that it seemed to defy the very limits of what was possible. It embodied luxury and comfort on a scale that turned ocean travel from an ordeal to be endured into an experience to be shared. It promised safety, With its innovative design and its watertight compartments and its reputation as unsinkable, a word that the White Star Line never officially used in their marketing, but that somehow attached itself to the ship in the public mind, becoming part of its mythology even before it sailed. And it offered something else, something harder to quantify, a kind of magic, a sense that to board the Titanic was to participate in something historic, to be part of the modern age in its most spectacular manifestation. For the wealthy, it represented the pinnacle of transatlantic travel, a floating palace where they could move between continents without sacrificing any of the comforts or social rituals that defined their lives. For the middle class, it offered a taste of elegance, a brief moment of living in a world of polished wood and fine linens and attentive service. For the poor, for the immigrants travelling in third class with all their worldly possessions packed into battered suitcases and cloth bundles, it represented something even more profound. It was the bridge between the life they had known and the life they hoped to build, the vessel that would carry them across not just an ocean but across the boundary between the past and the future. And for the crew, from the officers on the bridge to the stokers sweating in the heat of the boiler rooms, it was employment, a way to support families, a profession that connected them to the ancient human relationship with the sea. So when the RMS Titanic prepared for its maiden voyage in April of 1912, it did so at a moment when the world was balanced on the edge of transformation, when millions of people across continents and classes were searching for something: security, adventure, prosperity, escape, belonging. And for reasons as diverse as the passengers themselves, more than 2,000 individuals made the decision that this ship, on this particular voyage, would carry them toward whatever they were seeking. They could not have known, as they packed their bags and said their goodbyes and made their way to Southampton, that they were boarding not just a ship but a story that would echo through history, that their names and faces and final moments would become part of a narrative that humanity would tell and retell, trying to understand what it means when progress and hubris and chance and the cold indifference of nature collide in the middle of a dark Atlantic night. The decision to book passage on the RMS Titanic was rarely random. Behind each ticket purchased, each name added to the manifest, lay a constellation of circumstances and motivations as unique as the individuals themselves. For some, it was about prestige. To sail on the maiden voyage of the world's largest and most luxurious ship was to participate in a historic event, to be able to say for the rest of their lives that they had been there at the beginning. For others, it was purely practical. The Titanic was simply the next available ship heading in the direction they needed to go, its fame and reputation secondary to the basic need to get from one side of the Atlantic to the other. For families planning immigration, the choice of ship mattered less than the choice to leave everything familiar behind, to take the enormous gamble that life might be better in America than in the villages and cities where generations of their ancestors had been born and died. For the crew, there was no choice at all. They went where they were assigned, following the maritime profession that had shaped their lives and their identities. Consider John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, who boarded the Titanic in Cherbourg with his young pregnant wife Madeleine. His reason for returning to America was complex, tangled up in scandal and social judgment. He had divorced his first wife and married a woman decades younger, and the society that had once embraced him had turned cold and judgmental. He had taken Madeleine abroad partly to escape the scrutiny, and now they were returning home, seeking to reclaim their place in a world that had rejected them. For Astor, the Titanic offered not just luxury, which he could have afforded on any ship, but perhaps a kind of anonymity and grandeur, a place where he could exist for a few days without the weight of public opinion pressing down on every moment. His wealth could buy the finest suite on the ship, but it could not buy what he really sought: acceptance, peace, a future where his choices would cease to define him in the eyes of others. Or consider the young Lebanese family, the Saads and the Peters and so many others from the region around Beirut, who had pooled resources, sold property, said goodbye to everyone they'd ever known, all to purchase third-class tickets to America. For them, the Titanic was not a symbol or a luxury, but a doorway, the mechanism through which they would transport themselves from one existence to another. They had heard the stories, received the letters from relatives who had gone before, letters that spoke of work and wages and possibilities that simply did not exist in the Ottoman-controlled territories they were leaving. The journey itself was daunting. The overland trip to Cherbourg or Southampton, the processing and paperwork, the fear of medical inspections that could result in rejection and a forced return home, the knowledge that they were burning their bridges, that there would likely be no returning if things did not work out as hoped. But the alternative, staying in places where economic opportunity was scarce and political stability uncertain, seemed worse than the risk. So they came to the Titanic carrying children and cloth bundles and the kind of desperate hope that has always driven human migration, the willingness to endure hardship and uncertainty in exchange for a chance at something better. Between these extremes of wealth and poverty existed a vast middle ground of passengers whose stories were equally compelling if less frequently told. There was the Reverend Carter and his family, returning from missionary work, carrying with them the complicated legacy of religious service in foreign lands. There were businessmen like Benjamin Guggenheim, travelling for professional reasons, thinking about contracts and investments, rather than the historic nature of the ship beneath their feet. There were honeymooners like Daniel and Mary Marvin, for whom the Titanic represented not just transportation, but part of the adventure of their new life together, a romantic beginning to what they assumed would be decades of shared experience. There were professionals, teachers, engineers, artists, moving between continents for work or study or simply for the experience of travel, which was becoming more accessible to those beyond the truly wealthy. The ship's reputation played differently across these various groups. In first class, passengers expected and received surroundings that rivaled the finest hotels in the world, carved wood panelling, crystal chandeliers, and a la carte restaurants separate from the main dining saloon, a swimming pool, a gymnasium with the latest equipment, promenade decks where one could stroll and socialize. Second class on the Titanic was comparable to first class on most other ships, with comfortable cabins and a dining saloon that served elaborate meals with attentive service. Even third class, often called steerage on other vessels, was relatively spacious and clean by the standards of the time, with families given small cabins rather than the open dormitory-style accommodations that were common on immigrant ships. The White Star Line had recognized that the future of transatlantic travel lay not just in luxury for the rich, but in decent conditions for the masses who were remaking the demographic map of the world through immigration. But beyond the physical amenities, there was something else that drew people to the Titanic, the sense that it represented safety, that its size and its technology made it as close to unsinkable as human engineering could achieve. In an age when sea travel still carried real risks, when ships regularly encountered storms and mechanical failures and navigational errors, the promise of safety mattered enormously. Third-class passengers, many of whom had never seen the ocean before beginning their journey, took comfort in the ship's reputation. First-class passengers, accustomed to luxury but not to danger, appreciated the assurance that their comfort would not come at the cost of their security. This belief in the ship's invulnerability would later take on a terrible irony. But in the days before the voyage began, it was simply one more reason to choose the Titanic over any other vessel. And so they came, from across Britain and Europe and Scandinavia and the Middle East, Converging on the docks at Southampton and Cherbourg and Queenstown, this vast collection of humanity with nothing in common except the decision to board the same ship on the same voyage. They came carrying luggage that ranged from luxury trunks packed by servants to cloth bags stuffed with everything a family owned. They came speaking dozens of languages, practicing different religions, carrying different dreams and fears and expectations. They came as individuals and as families, as couples and as solitary travellers, as those who had chosen this journey and as those who simply had no other choice. And when they walked up the gangways and stepped onto the decks of the RMS Titanic, they became something more than just passengers. They became part of a story that none of them could have imagined. A story that would transform them from ordinary people living ordinary lives into characters in a narrative that would be told and retold for more than a century. Their choices and their final moments examined and analysed and memorialised by generations who would never know their faces but would never forget their names. If you could have stood at the Southampton dock on the 10th of April 1912, watching as the passengers boarded, you would have witnessed not just a logistical operation, but a cross-section of human existence at a particular moment in time. The manifest of the RMS Titanic reads like a census of the early 20th century world, a document that captures in names and ages and nationalities the vast diversity of human experience, from the most privileged to the most vulnerable, from those at the peak of their lives to those just beginning and those approaching the end. Behind each name was a story, a life that had led to that particular dock on that particular morning, a set of circumstances that had made this voyage seem necessary or desirable, or simply inevitable. In first class, you would have seen faces that were already famous, names that appeared regularly in newspapers and society columns. There was John Jacob Astor IV, at 47 still carrying the easy confidence of someone who had never had to question their place in the world, though recent scandal had taught him that wealth could not insulate him from judgment. His wife Madeline, just 18 and pregnant with their first child, moved through the boarding process with the careful grace of someone aware that eyes were always watching, always judging. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, travelling without his wife, accompanied by his mistress and valet, living the complicated personal life that wealth allowed, but society pretended not to notice. There was Isidor Straus and his wife Ida, owners of Macy's department store, elderly and devoted to each other, returning home after a European vacation that had been equal parts business and pleasure. There was the Countess of Roths, travelling with her cousin and her maid, carrying herself with the particular kind of poise that comes from being born into aristocracy, where status is not achieved but inherited, woven into the very fabric of identity. But first class was not exclusively the domain of old money and established families. There was Margaret Brown, who would later be nicknamed Molly by a Broadway play she never saw, a woman who had married into wealth rather than being born to it, whose forthright manner and American directness sometimes clashed with the more reserved style of old money society. There was the Countess of Roths, true nobility sitting beside the nouveau riche, a juxtaposition that would have been uncomfortable on land, but that seemed acceptable within the peculiar social space of an ocean liner, where the usual rules were suspended for the duration of the voyage. There were professional people as well, doctors, engineers, businessmen who had earned, rather than inherited their money, who travelled first class because they could afford it, but who still carried the sensibilities of people who remembered what it was like to worry about money. Second class contained perhaps the most interesting cross-section of passengers, families who were comfortable but not wealthy, professionals and small business owners, clergy and teachers, people who occupied the expanding middle ground between the very rich and the very poor. There was Lawrence Beasley, a schoolteacher travelling alone, a man who would later write one of the most detailed survivor accounts, his educator's eye for detail capturing moments that others might have overlooked. There was the Hart family, Esther and Benjamin, and their 7-year-old daughter Eva, returning to England after an attempt to build a new life in Canada, a venture that had not worked out as planned, carrying with them the particular sadness of dreams that had not come true. There were musicians and journalists, engineers and sole business owners, people whose lives were defined by their work rather than by inherited wealth or social position. And then there was third class, by far the largest group of passengers, more than 700 people crowded into the lower decks of the ship, a community unto themselves, separate from the luxury above, not just by the physical barriers of doors and staircases, but by the vast gulf of class and circumstance. Here were the immigrants, families who had sold everything to purchase these tickets, who were travelling with all their possessions packed into bundles and bags, who spoke limited or no English, who were embarking on journeys that would either remake their lives or break them. There were Swedish families leaving behind farms that had grown too small to support another generation, their children restless for opportunities that did not exist in rural Scandinavia. There were Irish from counties where poverty had become generational, where emigration was not an adventure but a necessity, where America represented not a dream, but simply the only option that offered hope. There were Lebanese and Syrian families, pioneers of a migration that would continue for decades, leaving behind the complex political situation of the Ottoman Empire for the uncertain but promising landscape of the New World. In third class, large families were common, parents travelling with 4, 5, 6 children, the youngest sometimes just infants being carried across an ocean to a future their parents could only imagine. There was the Sage family, 9 people travelling together, parents and children ranging from infancy to young adulthood, all with third-class tickets paid for by savings that represented years of labour. There was the Goodwin family, equally large, equally hopeful, equally vulnerable. There were single young men travelling alone, seeking work in American factories or mines or construction sites, planning to send money home until they could afford to bring their families across. There were young women, some travelling with relatives and some incredibly alone, seeking employment as domestic servants in American households, carrying letters of reference and addresses of family friends and a kind of courage that is easy to overlook from the comfortable distance of a century removed. And woven through all of this, connecting the decks and the classes and the separate worlds that existed within the single hull of the ship, was the crew, more than 800 men and women whose labour made the voyage possible, who were invisible to most passengers except when their service was needed. There were the officers on the bridge, professional mariners who had spent years learning their trade, who carried the responsibility of navigation and safety. There were the engineers and stokers deep below, working in heat and noise to keep the engines running, their bodies dark with coal dust, their world a stark contrast to the polished luxury of the decks above. There were stewards and stewardesses attending to passengers, serving meals, making beds, responding to requests with practiced professionalism, their own needs and comforts secondary to those of the people they served. There were cooks and bakers working around the clock to produce the elaborate meals expected in first class, and the simpler but substantial fare served in third. There were postal workers sorting mail in a dedicated room, musicians hired to provide entertainment, even a wireless operator who would become one of the voyage's most crucial figures, though no one knew it yet. Each of these people, from Astor in his luxury suite to the stoker shoveling coal in the bowels of the ship, from the elderly Strausses returning home to the infant Sage beginning a journey across the world, carried within them the accumulation of every experience they had ever had, every choice they had made, every dream they held, every fear they carried. They were not statistics or historical figures or names on a monument. They were living, breathing human beings, complex and contradictional and irreducibly themselves. And when they boarded the RMS Titanic, they brought all of that with them, creating within the ship's walls a temporary community of astonishing diversity, a cross-section of humanity so complete that to study the passenger list is to study the world itself in miniature, with all its hierarchies and hopes and inequalities and aspirations compressed into a single vessel, sailing toward a horizon that promised nothing but concealed everything. Among the possessions loaded onto the RMS Titanic in those early April days, the mountains of luggage, the cargo holds filled with goods ranging from machinery to fine wines, were items that carried a weight beyond their physical mass. In suitcases and pockets and carefully wrapped packages were letters, dozens and dozens of letters, written in the days and weeks before departure, sent ahead to announce arrivals or carried along to be mailed from the ship or from America. These letters, along with diary entries and the plans that existed only in people's minds, constitute a kind of collective voice, a chorus of hopes and fears and intentions that give texture to the bare facts of the voyage. They allow us to hear, across more than a century, the actual words of people who could not have known that their ordinary correspondence would become historical documents, treasured and analysed and preserved as windows into lives that ended too soon. Consider the letter written by Adolf Saalfeld, a chemist travelling in first class with a sample case of perfume products he hoped to sell to American buyers. In a note to his business partners, he expressed excitement about the opportunities that awaited, confidence that the American market would be receptive to their products, practical details about meetings scheduled for after his arrival in New York. His words were those of a professional focused on the future, making plans, thinking about business, his mind already leaping ahead to the days after the voyage. There is something poignant about the ordinariness of these concerns, the way they reveal a man thinking in terms of weeks and months and years ahead, constructing a future that would never arrive, making appointments that would never be kept. Or read the words of Kate Buss, a young woman travelling in second class, who wrote to friends describing the thrill of boarding such a magnificent ship, the elegance of the accommodations, the sense of adventure that came with embarking on a transatlantic voyage. Her letter bubbles with the particular excitement of someone young and educated and aware that she is participating in something special, her words capturing that breathless quality of discovery, of seeing something impressive for the first time. She described the carved wood, the fine linens, the other passengers, all with the keen observational skills of someone who knew she was collecting material for stories she would tell for the rest of her life. She was creating memories deliberately, consciously, trying to capture in words an experience that seemed already, even as it was happening, like something worth remembering. In third class, the letters had a different quality, weighted with more substantial hopes and more pressing fears. Many were written in languages other than English, sent to relatives in home villages, trying to explain the enormous decision to emigrate, seeking to reassure families that they would be all right, that America was real and reachable and worth the risk. A Lebanese mother wrote to her sister describing the journey so far, the difficulty of travelling with small children, the strangeness of everything, the fear that clawed at her in the night, the hope that sustained her during the day. She wrote about the children's excitement at seeing the big ship, about how her youngest had cried at the noise and the crowds, about how she was trying to be brave even though she felt terrified of the ocean crossing, of the unknown that waited on the other side. Her words reveal the emotional complexity of immigration. Not just hope, but fear. Not just excitement, but grief at leaving behind everything familiar, not just anticipation, but doubt. Some passengers were returning home rather than leaving it, and their letters carried a different emotional tone. Americans who had been touring Europe wrote about churches visited and museums explored and relatives seen, about being ready to return to familiar ground after weeks or months abroad. There was an eagerness in these letters, a desire to sleep in their own beds again, to eat familiar foods, to resume the routines and relationships that gave structure to their lives. They took the ship for granted in a way that immigrants could not. It was simply the mechanism of return, the means rather than the meaning. Yet even in this casualness, there was affection for the Titanic, appreciation for its comforts, satisfaction at having secured passage on such a fine vessel for the journey home. The crew too left paper trails, though fewer of their letters have survived or been preserved. Some wrote to wives and children explaining when they would return, enclosing money when possible, expressing the particular mix of duty and resignation that comes with a job that requires long absences from home. A stoker wrote to his mother about the good wages, about how he was saving to help his sister with her wedding, about the work being hard but bearable, about this being his last voyage before taking a shore job because he was getting too old for the physical demands of working the boilers. These were working-class letters, practical and unsentimental on the surface, but carrying beneath the plain language a subtext of love and responsibility and sacrifice. And then there were the letters never written, but implied in the decisions people made. The mental letters, the plans that existed as thoughts and intentions rather than words on paper. The immigrant father who had promised himself he would send for the rest of his family once he was established in America, who carried that promise like a weight, who measured every dollar against the cost of future tickets. The young woman who planned to work as a maid for a year or two before looking for a husband, who had a whole future mapped out in her mind, a sequence of steps that would lead from servitude to independence. The businessman who intended to finalize a deal that would secure his company's future, who had rehearsed his arguments, who was thinking 3 moves ahead like a chess player, constructing success in his imagination before attempting it in reality. All of these letters and plans and intentions were loaded onto the Titanic along with the trunks and the cargo and the coal that would fuel the engines. They were invisible freight, the hopes and dreams and fears that gave meaning to the physical journey. And in the days after the ship departed Southampton, some of these letters were written and mailed during the stops in Cherbourg and Queenstown, final messages sent from the last ports before the open ocean, last words that would reach their destinations while the writers were still at sea, creating a strange temporal paradox where the living voice of someone already dead would arrive in the mail days after their death, creating a moment of confusion and horror for the recipients who would read cheerful words while knowing the terrible truth. These paper traces, these fragments of intention and emotion captured in ink, transform the passenger list from a bureaucratic document into something far more human. They remind us that every name represented not just a person, but a consciousness, a perspective, a unique way of seeing and experiencing the world. They show us people thinking about the future, making plans, expressing love, managing fears, reaching out across distance to connect with others. They are the artifacts of ordinary life raised to extraordinary significance by the catastrophe that followed. And they allow us, across the vast distance of time, to hear actual voices rather than just reading statistics, to encounter the passengers of the Titanic not as victims, but as people who were alive and hoping and dreaming right up until the moment when the cold Atlantic water closed over them and silenced those voices forever. The boarding of the RMS Titanic was a spectacle that unfolded over several days, beginning on the morning of April 10th in Southampton and continuing with additional stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland. For the passengers arriving at each of these ports, the first sight of the ship was overwhelming. It was simply huge, larger than anything most people had ever seen that could move, its 4 massive funnels rising against the sky like the smokestacks of an industrial plant, its black hull stretching impossibly long, its decks stacked one upon another, creating a kind of vertical city. Even those who had expected grandeur found themselves momentarily stunned by the physical reality of the vessel, by the audacity of human engineering that had created something so enormous and so complex and set it floating on water. In Southampton, the process of boarding was organised by class, with first-class passengers arriving by motorcar or taxi, their luggage handled by porters and loaded separately, their path from the dock to their cabins smooth and attended. They walked up gangways carpeted and sheltered, into entrance halls decorated with carved wood and polished brass, where stewards waited to guide them to their accommodations. For these passengers, boarding was an extension of the luxury they experienced on land, seamless, comfortable, with every detail attended to by staff whose job was to make the transition as effortless as possible. They were shown to suites with sitting rooms and private promenades, to cabins with wardrobes and writing desks and ensuite bathrooms, to spaces that looked like elegant hotel rooms rather than ship's quarters. First class stretched across the uppermost decks, with easy access to the promenade where one could stroll and socialise, to the smoking room where men could retreat after dinner, to the reading room where women could gather, to all the public spaces designed to recreate on water the social geography of elite life on land. Second-class passengers boarded with less ceremony but with no less efficiency, finding themselves in accommodations that would have been considered luxurious on almost any other ship. Their cabins were smaller than those in first class, but comfortable and well appointed, with real beds rather than bunks, with portholes that let in natural light, with shared bathrooms that were nonetheless clean and modern. The second-class dining saloon was spacious and elegant, with long tables and attentive service and meals that, while not as elaborate as those in first class, were substantial and well prepared. For many second-class passengers, particularly those crossing the Atlantic for the first time, the ship represented a level of comfort and sophistication beyond anything they had experienced before. They explored their deck with a sense of wonder, peeking into the library, examining the menu posted outside the dining saloon, gathering on the aft well deck where they could breathe fresh air and watch the ocean pass beneath them. But it was in third class where the boarding process revealed most clearly the realities of class division in the early 20th century. Third-class passengers, mostly immigrants, mostly travelling in family groups, mostly carrying everything they owned in battered suitcases and cloth bundles, arrived at the dock in a different way, often having travelled for days already from their home villages, crossing borders and waiting in processing centres, undergoing medical inspections that could result in rejection and deportation. By the time they reached the Titanic, many were already exhausted, overwhelmed by the logistics of the journey and by the emotional weight of having left behind everything familiar. They boarded through different gangways than the first-class passengers, entrances located toward the stern and leading directly to the lower decks, and they navigated narrow corridors and steep staircases to find their cabins deep within the ship. Third-class accommodations were basic by the standards of luxury but relatively good by the standards of immigrant travel. Families received small cabins with bunk beds, just enough space to store their luggage and sleep. Single men and single women were housed in separate dormitory-style rooms, rows of bunks divided by gender for propriety. The third-class common areas were simpler than those above, with wooden benches rather than upholstered furniture, with plain walls rather than carved panels, but they were clean and reasonably spacious, and they included a general room where people could gather and socialize. For many immigrants, particularly those traveling from regions without significant industry or modern infrastructure, even these basic accommodations seemed impressive, a sign that they were being treated with a certain dignity, that they were not just cargo being transported, but passengers worthy of basic comfort. As the ship filled with people, it became a kind of living organism, humming with conversation in a dozen languages, echoing with footsteps and children's voices and the sound of luggage being moved into place. First-class passengers settled into their suites and then emerged to explore, strolling the promenades and examining the public rooms, greeting acquaintances and introducing themselves to neighbours, beginning the social rituals that would structure the days at sea. Second-class passengers did the same on their own deck, forming the quick acquaintances that arise among travellers, trading information about destinations and discussing the ship's features. In third class, the atmosphere was different, more chaotic, more emotional, with families trying to get children settled, with people overwhelmed by the strangeness of everything, with languages and customs mixing in ways that were confusing but also oddly comforting as people from different backgrounds discovered shared circumstances. Below decks, invisible to the passengers, the crew worked with practiced efficiency to prepare the ship for departure. In the boiler rooms, stokers began the process of building up steam pressure, shoveling coal into the massive furnaces that would power the engines. In the galley, cooks and kitchen staff unpacked provisions and began preparations for the first meals. Stewards moved through corridors, checking that cabins were ready, that supplies were stocked, that everything was in its place. On the bridge, officers reviewed charts and weather reports and the myriad details that went into navigating a ship of this size across an ocean. The wireless operators set up their equipment, testing signals, ready to send and receive the messages that kept the ship connected to the world even in the middle of the sea. When the Titanic finally departed Southampton on the afternoon of April 10th, there was a moment of drama that might have been read as an omen if anyone had been inclined towards superstition. The suction created by the massive ship's movement pulled another vessel, the New York, from its moorings, and the two ships came within feet of colliding before quick action by the harbour pilots and the Titanic's engines avoided disaster. Passengers lined the rails watching this near miss, some alarmed, some excited by the unexpected drama, few understanding that they had just witnessed a demonstration of the immense physical forces involved in moving something as large as the Titanic through water, forces that could not always be controlled as precisely as the ship's reputation suggested. But the moment passed, the crisis was averted, and the ship continued on its way, moving through the calm waters of the Southampton port and out into the English Channel, heading for Cherbourg where more passengers would board, then to Queenstown for the final stop before the open ocean. At each port the process repeated, new passengers coming aboard, more luggage being loaded, the ship growing fuller, the community forming and reforming, as new faces joined the temporary society forming within the ship's walls. And all the while passengers were discovering the vessel that would be their home for the next week, learning the geography of its decks, finding favourite spots where they would spend their time, settling into the rhythms of life at sea. They were, in those first days, creating the memories they expected to carry for a lifetime, the stories they would tell about their voyage on the world's most magnificent ship. They had no way of knowing that the ship itself would become the story, that the voyage would end not with arrival but with catastrophe, that the decks they were exploring and the cabins they were settling into would soon be underwater, part of a wreck resting in darkness 2 miles below the surface of the ocean. For now there was only the excitement of departure, the beginning of a journey, the sense of possibility that comes with setting out toward the horizon. Once the RMS Titanic left its final port and headed into the open Atlantic, life aboard settled into rhythms that were particular to ocean travel, a kind of suspended existence where the normal rules and routines of land gave way to something different, something shaped by the constancy of the ocean and the artificial boundaries of the ship itself. There was a timeless quality to these days at sea, each one similar to the one before, marked by meals and social gatherings and the slow passage of hours with nothing visible beyond the ship except water stretching to the horizon in every direction. For passengers, particularly those who had never made such a crossing before, this sense of being in a world apart, disconnected from land and from the usual markers of time and place, was both disconcerting and oddly freeing. In first class, the days followed a leisurely schedule designed around elaborate meals and social rituals. Breakfast was a substantial affair, served in the dining saloon or available à la carte in the restaurant, with passengers appearing in their day clothes, ready for a morning of gentle activity. After breakfast there were options: a constitutional walk around the promenade deck, bundled in coats against the Atlantic chill, conversations forming naturally as people fell into step with one another and circled the deck again and again. Some passengers used the gymnasium, a novelty on ocean liners, where they could try out the rowing machines and the electric horses and the other equipment under the supervision of the instructor. Others retreated to the reading room or the library, finding quiet spaces where they could write letters or read books, or simply sit and watch the ocean through the large windows. Lunch was another social occasion, less formal than dinner, but still requiring a certain standard of dress and behaviour. The dining saloon filled with conversation, with the clink of silverware against china, with stewards moving efficiently between tables taking orders and serving courses. The food was extraordinary, even by the first-class standards. Multiple courses, elaborately prepared, with choices that ranged from French haute cuisine to simpler English fare, all served on White Star Line china with the company's logo. For passengers like the Astors and the Strausses, accustomed to luxury, these meals were pleasant but not particularly remarkable. For passengers who were wealthy but not accustomed to such opulence, the dining experience itself became memorable, something to write home about, a glimpse into how the truly elite lived. Afternoons offered more leisure time. Some passengers napped in their cabins, adjusting to the disruption of their usual sleep schedules. Others gathered in the various public rooms, forming conversational groups that sometimes continued throughout the voyage, friendships or at least friendly acquaintanceships developing among people who might never have met on land, but who found themselves thrown together by circumstance in the artificial society of the ship. There were card games in the smoking room, where men could retreat away from women and children, where cigars and whiskey and male camaraderie created a particular atmosphere. There were tea times in the afternoon, when women gathered to gossip and observe one another, the social hierarchies of land replicating themselves even in this temporary floating community. Dinner was the culmination of each day, a formal affair that required first-class passengers to dress in their finest, the men in evening wear, the women in elaborate gowns and jewellery, the dining saloon transformed into a setting of extraordinary elegance. The meals lasted hours, course after course, with wines paired to each, with conversations flowing as freely as the champagne. The menu from the final dinner on April 14th has become famous, studied as a historical document. 11 courses, from oysters to roast duckling to Waldorf pudding, a feast that seemed designed to demonstrate that nothing, not even being in the middle of the ocean, could limit the luxury available to those who could afford it. After dinner, passengers could attend a concert by the ship's musicians, or continue conversations in the smoking room or the palm court, or simply stroll the decks under the stars before retiring to their cabins. In second class, the rhythms were similar but less elaborate, the meals substantial but not ostentatious, the social spaces comfortable but not opulent. Second-class passengers formed their own community, separate from first class by locked doors and class consciousness, separate from third class by economic circumstance and social identity. They were, in many ways, the most self-aware group on the ship, conscious of not belonging to the elite above them, but equally conscious of having risen above the poverty below them. Their conversations often revolved around work and ambition, around the lives they had built or were trying to build, around practical concerns mixed with aspirations. The library in second class saw steady use, as did the smoking room and the enclosed promenade where passengers could walk regardless of weather. There was a particular poignancy to second-class passengers like the Harts, the family returning from a failed attempt to emigrate to Canada. Their presence on the ship was not about adventure or luxury, but about retreat, about acknowledging that their dreams had not worked out and trying to return to familiarity with as much dignity as possible. Yet even in disappointment, there was something comforting about the voyage, the meals they did not have to cook, the time together as a family without the pressure of trying to survive in a strange place. The sense that they were moving toward rather than away from something. Their young daughter Eva would later remember these days with a strange double consciousness, knowing that she had been present for a historic tragedy, but also remembering the happiness of being with her parents, the specialness of being aboard such a magnificent ship. Third class had its own rhythms, less structured by the ship's schedule and more shaped by the particular circumstances of the passengers themselves. Meals were served at set times in the third-class dining saloon, hearty and simple, porridge and stews and bread, food that was substantial if not sophisticated, enough to keep hunger at bay during the days at sea. Between meals, third-class passengers gathered in the general room, where people from different countries and cultures mixed in ways that would have been unusual on land. Language barriers made some interactions difficult, but they did not prevent the formation of friendships, particularly among children who played together, regardless of whether they could understand each other's words. There was music in third class, informal and spontaneous, passengers bringing out instruments and playing folk songs from their homelands, others joining in with singing or dancing, creating moments of joy and release from the anxiety that many felt about the journey and about what awaited them in America. These gatherings had a vitality that the more formal entertainments in first class lacked, a sense of community forged from shared circumstance rather than social obligation. Swedish songs mixed with Irish ballads mixed with Syrian melodies, a musical tapestry that reflected the diversity of the immigrant experience. For families travelling with children, the days were structured around keeping the young ones occupied and managing their energy in the confined space of the ship. Parents improvised games, told stories, explored the limited areas of the ship accessible to third-class passengers, the well deck where they could get fresh air, the corridors where children could run off some of their restless energy. Their voyage was particularly hard on infants and toddlers, too young to understand where they were or why, responding to their parents' anxiety with fussiness and crying, creating stress for families already overwhelmed by the magnitude of their decision to emigrate. Throughout the ship, from the luxury of first class to the simplicity of third, from the officers on the bridge to the stokers in the boiler rooms, there was a sense of routine, of a small world functioning according to its own internal logic, largely separate from the vast ocean that surrounded it. Passengers became accustomed to the gentle roll of the ship, to the constant background hum of the engines, to the particular quality of light that came through portholes and windows, to the smell of salt air, mixed with the sense of cooking from the galleys and smoke from the funnels. They adjusted to the artificial constraints of the ship's geography, learning where they were allowed to go and where they were not, accepting the invisible but firmly maintained boundaries between classes. And beneath all the activity, beneath the meals and the conversations and the music and the routines, there was the ocean, dark and cold and immense, indifferent to the fragile human society floating on its surface. The Atlantic in April is a treacherous place, its waters still carrying the chill of winter, its currents pushing ice southward from the Arctic regions, its weather capable of turning violent with little warning. But in those days, as the Titanic steamed westward, the ocean was calm, almost unnaturally so, its surface like glass under skies that were clear and bright. It was beautiful, this vast expanse of water, but it was also alien, a reminder that for all the luxury and technology and human confidence aboard the ship, they were travelling through a realm that was fundamentally hostile to human life, where survival depended entirely on the integrity of the vessel carrying them and the skill of the men navigating it. The passengers, for the most part, did not dwell on these thoughts. They trusted the ship, trusted its reputation, trusted the White Star Line, and the officers and the assurances of safety that had been part of the marketing and the mystique. They were focused on their own concerns, the lives they had left behind, the futures they were moving toward, the immediate experiences of the voyage itself. They were living in the moment, creating memories, existing in that strange temporal bubble that ocean travel creates, where the past has been left at the dock and the future has not yet arrived, and there is only the present, only the ship and the ocean and the other passengers, and the slow passage of days marked by meals and sunsets, and the constant, rhythmic turning of the ship's propellers pushing them westward toward an America that seemed both impossibly distant and drawing closer with each hour. The social structure aboard the RMS Titanic was not merely a matter of where passengers slept or ate, but a reflection of the broader hierarchies that shaped the world in 1912. The ship was, in many ways, a floating microcosm of contemporary society, with all its stratifications and inequalities rendered visible by the physical architecture of decks and doors and deliberately separated spaces. To travel from the opulence of first class down through the comfortable simplicity of second class and into the crowded but hopeful world of third class was to traverse not just vertical space but the entire social order of the age, to see in miniature the vast distances that separated the wealthiest from the poorest members of society. First class occupied the most desirable real estate on the ship, the upper decks with easy access to open air and promenades, with spacious public rooms and elaborate private accommodations. The luxury was not accidental but carefully designed to appeal to passengers who lived in mansions and travelled regularly, who judged the ship not by the standards of ordinary ocean travel, but by comparison to the finest hotels in New York and London and Paris. The first-class suites were genuinely grand, with multiple rooms and private promenades, decorated in styles that ranged from Louis XV to Renaissance to English country house, giving passengers a choice of aesthetic experiences. Even standard first-class cabins featured amenities that would have seemed extravagant on other ships. Carved woodwork, electric heaters, ensuite bathrooms with hot and cold running water, closets large enough to accommodate the extensive wardrobes that wealthy passengers travelled with. But the luxury was not just about physical comfort. It was about maintaining a way of life, about creating an environment where the wealthy could exist without having to acknowledge or interact with the reality of poverty and struggle that existed just a few decks below them. First-class passengers could spend the entire voyage without ever seeing third class, without being confronted with the crowded conditions or the anxiety of immigrants or the reality that their luxury was made possible by the labour of crew members working in heat and noise far below the waterline. The segregation was enforced by locked gates, and crew members, stationed to politely but firmly redirect anyone who tried to cross class boundaries without authorization. This separation was presented as being for everyone's benefit, to maintain order, to protect the privacy and comfort of first-class passengers, to prevent the spread of disease from the lower decks. But its primary function was to reinforce social hierarchies, to ensure that even in the egalitarian space of a ship at sea, class distinctions remained firmly in place. Second class existed in a kind of middle ground, physically and socially situated between the extremes above and below. Second-class accommodations on the Titanic were genuinely comfortable, comparable to first class on older or smaller ships, designed to attract middle-class professionals and families who could afford better than steerage, but not the extravagant cost of first-class tickets. The second-class dining saloon was elegant, with mahogany furniture and linoleum that mimicked expensive tile, with a menu that offered multiple courses and genuine variety. The library was well stocked with books and periodicals, the smoking room comfortable, the promenade deck enclosed against weather, allowing passengers to walk and socialize regardless of conditions outside. Yet despite these comforts, second-class passengers were always conscious of the distinction between themselves and those above them. They could see the first-class promenades, could observe the elegant passengers strolling there, could glimpse through windows the opulence of spaces they were not permitted to enter. This proximity to wealth without access to it created a particular kind of awareness, a sense of aspiration mixed with pragmatism. Many second-class passengers were people on their way up socially, professionals and business people who were doing well but not yet arrived, for whom the voyage itself represented their current station. Comfortable, respectable, but still striving, still working towards something better. The interactions between second-class passengers often reflected this shared circumstance. Conversations revolved around work and opportunity, around plans and ambitions, around the practical concerns of people who had to manage money carefully, even as they enjoyed a level of comfort beyond what most people in the world experienced. There was a camaraderie among them, a sense of shared identity that came from occupying the middle ground, from being neither wealthy enough to be careless nor poor enough to be desperate. They formed friendships easily, bonded by their similar circumstances, and by the recognition that they were all navigating the same social and economic landscape, trying to build security and prosperity through their own efforts, rather than inheriting it or receiving it as charity. Third class was a different world entirely, separated from the decks above not just by physical barriers, but by an entire set of assumptions about what people in steerage needed or deserved. The accommodations, while better than on many immigrant ships, were basic and crowded. Cabins were small, with bunk beds and just enough space to store luggage, shared among families or assigned to dormitory-style rooms for single travellers separated by gender. The common areas were simple, wooden benches rather than upholstered chairs, plain walls rather than decorated panels, open spaces designed for functionality rather than aesthetics. But what third class lacked in physical comfort, it made up for in human vitality. The third class general room was alive with conversation and music and the chaos of children playing, with families trying to keep some semblance of routine in an environment that was foreign and disorienting, with young people forming friendships and courtships, with elderly passengers sitting quietly, lost in thoughts about the lives they were leaving behind and the uncertain futures ahead. The diversity in third class was extraordinary. Swedish farmers sitting near Syrian merchants, Irish labourers talking with English servants, language barriers bridged by gesture and goodwill and the shared experience of emigration. For these passengers, the voyage was not a pleasant interlude but a trial to be endured, a necessary passage from the old life to the new. Many were seasick, unaccustomed to the motion of the ocean, suffering, in the close quarters of the lower decks where the movement of the ship was most pronounced. Others were homesick, already missing the families and places they had left behind, wondering if they had made the right choice, if the gamble would pay off, if America would really be better than the villages and cities they had abandoned. Parents worried about their children, about how they would adapt, about whether they would maintain their language and culture or become wholly American, absorbed into a new identity. Young people felt the pull of possibility more strongly than fear, excited by the adventure even as they were anxious about the unknown. The meals in third class were adequate but monotonous compared to those in the classes above. Porridge for breakfast, stew for dinner, bread and tea and simple fare designed to sustain rather than delight. Yet there was something equalizing about these shared meals, about sitting at long communal tables where strangers became acquaintances, where the barriers of language and culture broke down in the universal human need to eat and the ritual of gathering for meals. Food brought people together, created moments of community in an environment that could otherwise feel isolating and overwhelming. The crew moved through all these different worlds, connecting them through their labour while remaining largely invisible to the passengers they served. Stewards attended to first-class passengers with practiced deference, anticipating needs before they were expressed, maintaining the illusion that luxury simply happened, that rooms cleaned themselves and meals appeared as if by magic. Other crew members worked in the spaces passengers never saw, the boiler rooms where stokers maintained the fires, the engine rooms where engineers monitored the massive machinery, the galleys where cooks and kitchen staff worked around the clock, the crew quarters where off-duty workers tried to rest in narrow bunks in crowded rooms. There was a hierarchy among the crew as well, with officers and skilled workers occupying a different social position than stokers and deckhands, with distinctions of rank and responsibility creating their own stratifications. But all of them, regardless of position, were bound by the discipline of shipboard life, by the need to maintain the functioning of this complex system that kept the Titanic moving safely across the ocean. They were professionals doing a job, most of them experienced mariners who had spent years at sea, who understood the risks and the routines, who took pride in their work even as they chafed under the demands and the long hours away from home. When examined from a distance of more than a century, the class divisions aboard the Titanic seem both stark and absurd. The waste of such extreme luxury existing side by side with basic accommodations, the moral failing of a system that valued some lives so much more highly than others, the way that class status determined not just comfort during the voyage, but ultimately the likelihood of survival when disaster struck. Yet these divisions were not unique to the Titanic. They were the normal structure of society at the time, accepted by almost everyone as the natural order of things. The wealthy believed they deserved their privileges, the middle class aspired to join them, and the poor hoped simply to improve their circumstances enough to achieve basic security. The ship did not create these hierarchies. It merely reflected them, made them visible in the architecture of decks and the rituals of service and the locked gates that kept people in their designated spaces. And yet, for all the divisions, there was something fundamentally shared among everyone aboard the Titanic, the basic humanity, the hopes and fears and loves that transcend class and circumstance. A mother in first class worried about her children in fundamentally the same way as a mother in third class. A young person seeking adventure felt the same excitement regardless of which deck they walked. Fear and joy and exhaustion and wonder are not the exclusive property of any social class. They are the common inheritance of all human beings. The tragedy of the Titanic would ultimately reveal this shared humanity, would show in the final hours how artificial these divisions were, how quickly the normal structures of society could collapse when confronted with genuine crisis. But in the days before that crisis, The hierarchies held, and passengers existed in their separate worlds, connected only by the fact that they were all aboard the same ship, all travelling toward the same destination, all trusting that the vessel beneath them was as safe and as unsinkable as its reputation suggested. Among the more than 800 crew members aboard the RMS Titanic were men and women whose lives were defined by the sea, by the profession of keeping ships running and passengers comfortable during their journeys across the ocean. They were invisible to most passengers, except when their service was required, their labour creating the luxury and efficiency that made the voyage possible, their expertise navigating the ship safely through waters that could turn dangerous without warning. To understand the Titanic fully requires understanding not just the passengers but the crew, the complex social world below decks where work never stopped, and where the smooth operation of the ship depended on hundreds of individual workers performing their duties with precision and professionalism. At the top of the crew hierarchy were the ship's officers, professional mariners who had spent years learning their trade, working their way up through ranks from junior positions to command. Captain Edward Smith was perhaps the most respected captain in the White Star Line fleet, nearing retirement after a long and largely successful career, chosen to command the Titanic on its maiden voyage as a kind of capstone to his professional life. He was known as a safe, conservative captain, not given to taking unnecessary risks, trusted by his employers and respected by his crews. Under him served a team of officers responsible for different aspects of the ship's operation: navigation, safety, cargo, passenger services, each one trained in the complex skills required to manage a vessel of this size and complexity. The officers lived in a different world than the rest of the crew, with better quarters and higher status, their authority enforced by tradition and by the rigid hierarchies of naval organization. They were responsible for making the decisions that kept the ship on course and safe, for responding to changing weather and sea conditions, for maintaining discipline among the crew, for projecting confidence to passengers who trusted that the men on the bridge knew what they were doing. Most of them were English, products of a maritime tradition that stretched back centuries, trained in an era when knowledge and skill were passed down through apprenticeship and experience rather than formal schooling. They understood the sea intimately, knew its moods and dangers, had survived storms and mechanical failures and all the various crises that could occur during an ocean crossing. Below the officers, but still in positions of relative privilege and respect, were the skilled workers who kept the ship running, the engineers who maintained the massive engines and boilers, the carpenters and plumbers and electricians who handled repairs and maintenance, the wireless operators who kept the ship connected to the world beyond the horizon through the relatively new technology of radio communication. These were men with specialized training, whose expertise made them valuable, who could find good employment on ships or on land, but who often preferred the maritime life despite its hardships. Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, the wireless operators, worked in a small room filled with equipment, sending and receiving messages around the clock, transmitting passenger telegrams and ship business and the routine navigational warnings that were part of transatlantic travel. Their work was tedious but important, requiring technical skill and alertness, keeping them isolated from most of the ship's social life but connected to a larger world of ships and shore stations and the invisible network of wireless communication that was beginning to link the globe. The largest segment of the crew were the service workers, stewards and stewardesses who attended to passengers, cooks and bakers and kitchen staff who prepared meals, servers who worked the dining saloons, cabin staff who cleaned and maintained passenger accommodations. These workers were the face of the ship for most passengers, the people they interacted with daily, whose competence and courtesy shaped the passenger experience. They worked long hours for modest wages, their labour invisible when it was done well, noticed only when something went wrong. Stewards assigned to first class enjoyed somewhat better conditions and tips than those serving other classes, but all of them worked hard managing the demands of passengers who expected seamless service, cleaning and serving and attending to hundreds of small tasks that kept the ship running smoothly. Among the service crew were some of the few women employed aboard, stewardesses who attended to female passengers and families with children, who worked primarily in second and third class where the need for such service was considered appropriate. These women occupied a complicated position in the ship's social hierarchy. They were workers, but their gender placed them outside the normal male world of seafaring, making them simultaneously more vulnerable and accorded certain protections. They received lower wages than male crew members doing comparable work, a common inequity of the time, but they were also considered deserving of special consideration in any emergency, their status as women overriding their status as workers in the moral calculus of the age. And then there were the men who worked in the depths of the ship, in the boiler rooms and engine rooms where the heat was oppressive and the noise was deafening and the work was physically brutal. The stokers, also called firemen, spent their shifts shoveling coal into the massive furnaces that generated steam to power the engines, working in conditions that were hellish even by the standards of early industrial labour. The boiler rooms were hot enough to cause heat exhaustion, dirty with coal dust that coated everything, loud with the roar of fires and the hiss of steam, dangerous with the risk of burns and mechanical injuries. The men who worked there were typically from the working class, employed in one of the few jobs available to men without specialised skills, earning wages that were better than common labour on land, but paid for with physical suffering and years shaved off their lives from the unhealthy conditions. These stokers and trimmers and greasers, more than 200 of them aboard the Titanic, were essential to the ship's operation, but largely invisible to passengers who never ventured into the working bowels of the vessel. They lived in crowded crew quarters, ate plain food in mess halls, took what rest they could between shifts, their world entirely separate from the luxury above them. Many of them were supporting families back home, sending most of their wages to wives and children, seeing shipboard work as the best option available in an economy that offered limited choices to men without education or capital. They took pride in their work despite its difficulty, developed a camaraderie that came from shared hardship, maintained the fires that kept the ship moving westward at a steady pace. The crew also included many people whose work was less visible but equally necessary. Postal workers sorting mail in the ship's dedicated post office, printers producing the daily menus and newsletters, butchers preparing meat in the cold storage rooms, bakers working through the night to ensure fresh bread for breakfast, carpenters and plumbers and electricians maintaining the complex systems that provided light and heat and running water. The Titanic was essentially a small city afloat, and like any city, it required an army of workers performing countless specialized tasks to keep everything functioning. For many crew members, shipboard life was not a choice made from among many options, but the best or only option available given their skills and circumstances. Maritime work offered steady employment in an era when jobs were often uncertain, when economic downturns could leave workers unemployed and desperate. It offered wages that, while not generous, were enough to support families, to provide basic security in a world where most working-class people lived without any safety net. And for some it offered something else, a sense of purpose, a connection to an ancient profession, the satisfaction of doing skilled work well, the camaraderie of crews who depended on each other in ways that land-based workers rarely did. But the work also came with costs. Crew members spent long stretches away from home, missing births and birthdays and the daily life of their families. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous, with injuries common and deaths not unheard of. The discipline was strict, the hours long, the accommodations crowded and basic. And always there was the risk inherent in sea travel, the knowledge that storms and mechanical failures and human error could turn a routine voyage into a disaster, that to work aboard a ship was to trust that the vessel was sound and the officers competent and fortune would be kind. In the days before the night of April 14th, the crew of the Titanic performed their duties with the routine professionalism that comes from experience, most of them unaware that this voyage would be anything other than ordinary. They maintained the engines and served the meals and cleaned the cabins and stood their watches, following the rhythms that had structured their working lives for years. They were not heroes yet, not victims yet, just workers doing their jobs, men and women whose names would have faded into historical obscurity if not for the catastrophe that was approaching, if not for the final hours when their training and their courage and their humanity would be tested in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Among them were men who would die at their posts, keeping the engines running and the lights on as the ship sank. Among them were those who would help passengers into lifeboats even as they understood there would be no room for themselves. And among them were those who would survive carrying guilt and trauma that would shadow the rest of their lives, marked forever by a single night when the routine voyage became a test of everything they believed about themselves and their duty and the meaning of their labour. As the RMS Titanic steamed westward through the North Atlantic, the world around it continued with rhythms that had nothing to do with the small floating community of passengers and crew. The ocean stretched vast and empty in every direction, its surface calm under clear skies, its depths holding cold currents and ancient mysteries that human beings had barely begun to explore. The weather in mid-April was unusually mild, the wind light, the seas smooth as glass. Conditions that made for comfortable travel, but that also created an odd sense of stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something undefined to unfold. By April 14th, the ship had been at sea for 4 days since leaving Queenstown, falling into the routines that had already become familiar. Passengers had adjusted to life aboard, had found their favourite spots and formed their acquaintances, had settled into the particular rhythm of days measured by meals and sunsets, and the slow passage of ocean beyond the ship's railings. In first class, the wealthy continued their comfortable existence, largely insulated from the running of the ship, their biggest concerns being what to wear to dinner and who to socialise with. In second class, families and professionals enjoyed the voyage, appreciating the comfort while remaining conscious of the cost, making the most of an experience that for many was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. In third class, immigrants counted down the days until arrival, anxious to reach America and begin the new lives they had travelled so far to claim. The night came on clear and cold, the temperature dropping as the sun set, the stars emerging with unusual brightness in a sky unmarred by clouds or haze. Passengers who ventured onto the decks remarked on how beautiful it was, how the ocean looked almost black under the starlight, how the air was crisp and sharp in the lungs. In the first-class dining saloon, the final dinner service proceeded with its usual elegance, 11 courses served over hours, conversations flowing, passengers dressed in their finest evening wear, the social rituals of the wealthy playing out exactly as they had on previous nights. Musicians played in the reception room providing ambience, their melodies drifting through the ship's corridors. In second class, passengers finished their simpler but still substantial meals, some retiring early and others gathering in the smoking room or the library. In third class, families of couples settled children into bunks, young people gathered in the general room for music and dancing, the energy and noise of working-class social life filling the lower decks. Below decks, the crew worked their shifts with routine efficiency. In the boiler rooms, stokers maintained the fires, shoveling coal in the oppressive heat, keeping the steam pressure steady, their work never stopping regardless of what was happening in the passenger areas above them. In the engine rooms, engineers monitored gauges and made adjustments, ensuring that the massive reciprocating engines and the turbine continued their steady work of turning the propellers. On the bridge, officers stood watch, following the ship's planned course, making minor adjustments to maintain heading, monitoring the horizon for other ships and any hazards. The wireless operators continued their work, transmitting messages, receiving routine traffic, among which were several warnings from other ships in the area about us. Icebergs spotted floating in the shipping lanes, driven south by currents from the Arctic. Hazards that required attention but that were not particularly unusual for April in the North Atlantic. These ice warnings had been arriving throughout the day, transmitted from various ships that had encountered or observed icebergs in the region the Titanic was approaching. Some of these warnings reached the bridge and were noted by the officers, who adjusted the ship's course slightly south to avoid the worst of the ice field. Other warnings were received by the wireless operators but not immediately delivered to the bridge, delayed because the operators were busy with passenger messages, with the commercial traffic that was part of their duties and that took precedence over routine navigational information. The warnings themselves were not alarming. Encountering ice in this region at this time of year was common, and the officers were experienced in dealing with such conditions, confident in their ability to see hazards in time to avoid them, trusting in the ship's size and strength to handle anything they might encounter. As the night deepened, the temperature continued to drop, the cold penetrating even through the ship's walls, causing passengers to bundle in heavier clothes or retreat to their heated cabins. The ocean remained extraordinarily calm, its surface smooth, reflecting the starlight like a dark mirror. This unusual calmness, while beautiful and comfortable for passengers, created a problem for navigation. Without waves or wind, there would be no water breaking around the base of an iceberg, no white foam to make it visible against the dark background of sea and night. Lookouts stationed in the crow's nest peered into the darkness ahead, their eyes straining to catch any sign of danger, but they were working under difficult conditions, without binoculars which had been misplaced or locked away, relying only on their vision and their experience to spot hazards in time to sound a warning. In the final hours of that Sunday night, the Titanic continued steaming at nearly full speed, about 22 knots, faster than was perhaps prudent given the ice warnings, but consistent with the practice of the time, when maintaining schedule was considered important, and when slowing down for conditions that might or might not materialize was seen as excessive caution. Captain Smith, dining with passengers and then retiring to his cabin, trusted his officers to manage the watch, to respond appropriately to any situation that arose. The passengers, preparing for bed or gathered in the still active public rooms, were unaware of the ice warnings, unaware that the ship was entering a region where danger lurked just beyond the range of visibility. They trusted the ship and its crew absolutely, confident in the reputation of the Titanic as the safest vessel afloat, never imagining that within hours their trust would be betrayed not by incompetence but by the simple fact that human technology and confidence are no match for the indifference of nature. The stars shone cold and bright overhead, their light travelling across unimaginable distances to illuminate a scene of perfect tranquility. A great ship moving steadily through calm waters, its lights glowing warm against the darkness, its passengers and crew going about their routines, creating a small bubble of human civilization in the midst of the vast emptiness of the ocean. It was beautiful and it was fragile, this floating world, this temporary community of more than 2,000 souls who had entrusted their lives to steel and engineering and the professional competence of mariners. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, invisible against the black water, a mountain of ice drifted on the current, ancient and silent and utterly indifferent to the approaching ship, waiting with the patience of inanimate matter for the moment when it and the Titanic would meet, when the unstoppable would encounter the immovable, when the confidence of a civilization would collide with the hard reality of the natural world. The collision, when it came at 11:40 that night, was not dramatic in the way that catastrophes are often imagined. There was no violent crash, no explosive sound that echoed through the ship, no immediate obvious crisis that would have sent passengers into panic. Instead, it was almost gentle, a grinding, scraping sound that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, accompanied by a shudder that ran through the ship's frame, noticeable but not alarming, curious more than frightening. Passengers in their cabins paused in their reading or their conversations, felt the vibration, heard the strange noise, wondered briefly what it meant before returning to their activities. On deck, a few passengers who were enjoying the night air watched as chunks of ice fell onto the forward well deck, broken off from the iceberg as the ship scraped past it, the ice visible for a moment before the ship moved on and the berg disappeared into the darkness astern. In the crow's nest, Lookout Frederick Fleet had seen the iceberg emerge from the darkness directly ahead, a looming shadow that gave him barely 40 seconds of warning before impact. He struck the bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge with the terse warning, "Iceberg right ahead." On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch, commanding the watch, had only moments to respond, ordering the engines reversed and the helm turned hard to starboard in an attempt to avoid the berg or at least reduce the force of impact. The ship began to turn, slowly because of its immense mass and momentum, and for a moment it seemed possible that the manoeuvre might work, that the Titanic would slip past the ice with only a glancing blow. But the iceberg was larger than it appeared from the surface, its bulk extending deep below the waterline, and as the Titanic turned, the submerged portion of the berg scraped along the starboard side, opening a series of small holes and gaps in the steel plating, creating openings through which water began to flow into the forward compartments of the ship. The damage was not immediately visible from above, no gaping wound that would have made the crisis obvious. But below the waterline in the cargo holds and the forward boiler rooms, water was pouring in with relentless pressure, flooding spaces that were supposed to remain dry, overwhelming the pumps, rising steadily against the watertight bulkheads that were designed to limit the spread of flooding. Captain Smith, awakened by the collision, hurried to the bridge and quickly understood from his officers' reports that something serious had happened. He ordered an inspection of the damage, sending crew members below to assess the extent of flooding. The reports that came back were alarming. Water was entering multiple compartments, the forward cargo holds were flooded, Boiler Room 6 was filling rapidly. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who was aboard for the maiden voyage, was summoned to the bridge, and together he and the captain reviewed the reports and tried to calculate what they meant. Andrews understood immediately that the situation was catastrophic. The Titanic had been designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of its forward compartments flooded, but the damage extended across 5 compartments, possibly 6. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The ship was going to sink, and there was nothing that could be done to prevent it. The only question was how long it would take, and Andrews estimated perhaps an hour, 2 at most. For the passengers, the first indication that something was seriously wrong came slowly, in bits and pieces, rather than as a single clear announcement. Some noticed that the engines had stopped, that the constant vibration and hum that had been a background presence for days had suddenly ceased, leaving an unnatural silence. Some felt the ship beginning to tilt slightly forward as the bow settled deeper into the water under the weight of the flooding forward compartments. Crew members began moving through the corridors with unusual urgency, knocking on cabin doors, instructing passengers to dress warmly and put on life jackets and come up to the boat deck. The tone was calm, the instructions matter of fact, nothing to suggest immediate danger, and many passengers responded with confusion or mild annoyance rather than fear, unable to understand why they were being asked to leave their warm cabins and venture onto the cold decks in the middle of the night. In first class, stewards moved through the corridors with practiced courtesy, their voices calm even as they delivered instructions that would save lives. "Please put on warm clothing and your life jacket and proceed to the boat deck," the message repeated at dozens of cabin doors, received with varying degrees of compliance and resistance. Some passengers dressed quickly and followed instructions, trusting that the crew knew what they were doing even if the reason was unclear. Others were skeptical, reluctant to leave comfortable cabins for what seemed like an unnecessary drill, questioning why this couldn't wait until morning. The life jackets seemed particularly absurd to some passengers, bulky and awkward, worn over evening clothes and coats, making everyone look ridiculous, surely not necessary on the world's unsinkable ship. In second and third class, the process was more chaotic. There were fewer crew members to guide passengers, language barriers that made instructions difficult to understand, families with children who needed time to dress and organize themselves, corridors that became crowded and confusing as people tried to find their way to the upper decks. Some third-class passengers found gates locked, physical barriers between them and the boat deck, though whether these gates were locked due to immigration regulations or simple neglect or deliberate class discrimination remains a matter of historical debate. What is clear is that third-class passengers faced more obstacles reaching the lifeboats than those in the classes above them, that their chances of survival were diminished not just by their location in the ship, but by a system that treated them as less important, less deserving of the effort and resources necessary to save them. On the boat deck, crew members worked to prepare the lifeboats for launch, a process that was more difficult than it should have been, because the ship had never conducted a full lifeboat drill, because many crew members were uncertain about the procedures, because the davits and falls were stiff from newness and cold. The lifeboats themselves were a study in inadequacy. There were only 16 standard lifeboats plus 4 collapsible boats, enough capacity for about 1,200 people on a ship carrying more than 2,000. This shortfall was legal, compliant with outdated maritime regulations that calculated lifeboat capacity based on tonnage rather than on the number of people aboard, regulations that had not kept pace with the increasing size of ships. The Titanic's designers had actually included davits capable of handling more lifeboats, and there was deck space to accommodate them, but the decision had been made to carry only the minimum required by law, apparently because more lifeboats would clutter the deck and interfere with the first-class promenade, because the ship was considered so safe that lifeboats were needed primarily to rescue passengers from other vessels, not to save people from the Titanic itself. As the reality of the situation began to penetrate, as passengers emerging onto the deck saw crew members working frantically on the boats, as the tilt of the ship became more pronounced and the bow visibly lower in the water, the atmosphere began to change from confusion to the first stirrings of fear. Officers began ordering passengers into lifeboats, prioritizing women and children according to the maritime tradition of the time, though the exact interpretation of this principle varied between port and starboard sides of the ship, with some officers allowing men to board if no women and children were immediately available, while others enforced a stricter standard. The first boats were lowered half empty, partly because passengers were reluctant to leave the seemingly solid deck for a small boat on the dark ocean, partly because crew members feared the davits would fail if boats were fully loaded, partly because in the early stages few people fully believed that the ship was truly sinking, that the lifeboats were not a precaution but a necessity. The process of loading and launching lifeboats would continue for more than an hour. boats descending one by one from the davits with their passengers, crew members rowing them away from the ship to prevent them being pulled down when the Titanic sank. And while this desperate work proceeded on the deck, below decks the crew continued their duties, engineers and stokers maintaining power as long as possible, so that lights would continue functioning and pumps would keep running and wireless would remain operational. Musicians gathered in the first-class entrance and played music to maintain calm and provide courage. Stewards continued assisting passengers even as they understood that there would be no place for them in the boats. In these actions, in the face of approaching death, the crew of the Titanic demonstrated a professionalism and a courage that transcended their ordinary roles, that transformed them from workers into heroes, that showed what human beings are capable of when confronted with impossible circumstances and certain doom. And deep in the cold Atlantic water, flowing unstoppably through the holes torn in the Titanic's hull, the ocean continued its work of claiming the ship, indifferent to the drama playing out on deck, following the simple physical laws that govern buoyancy and weight, laws that cannot be negotiated with or appealed to, that render meaningless all human concepts of fairness and justice and deserving. The ship was sinking slowly but inevitably, and the only question left was who would survive and who would die, whose names would appear on the lists of rescued, and whose would be added to the endless roll of those lost to the sea. In the midst of chaos and confusion, as the full reality of the disaster began to settle over the passengers and crew of the RMS Titanic, individual human beings were faced with choices that would define not just their final hours but their legacy, that would determine how they would be remembered by those who survived and by the generations that would study this night in the years to come. These were not choices made with time for reflection or debate, but split-second decisions driven by instinct and character and the particular moral framework that each person carried within them, shaped by upbringing and experience and belief about what it meant to be a decent human being. Consider the decisions made by fathers and husbands who understood that the boats would hold only women and children, who were faced with the stark knowledge that ensuring their family's survival meant accepting their own deaths. These men helped their wives and daughters into lifeboats, spoke words of comfort and reassurance, even as both parties understood they were saying goodbye, maintained composure in moments that must have felt like the end of the world. Their courage was not the dramatic kind that involves action and heroism in the conventional sense, but the quieter, more devastating courage of letting go, of stepping back, of choosing to face death so that others might live. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who owned Macy's department store, provided perhaps the most poignant example of this kind of choice. When offered a place in a lifeboat, Ida refused to leave her husband, telling officers, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so will we die together." Witnesses reported seeing them sitting together on deck chairs as the ship sank, an image that has come to symbolize marital devotion and the choice of love over survival. Isidore had been offered a place in the boats due to his age, but he refused, unwilling to accept privilege while younger men were left behind. Their decision to die together rather than be separated has become legendary, a story retold countless times as an example of love that transcends even the survival instinct. Though it must be acknowledged that their choice, however admirable, left children and grandchildren to mourn them both, rather than saving at least one parent. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet reportedly changed out of their life jackets and back into evening wear, determined to die like gentlemen if die they must. Guggenheim's last recorded words delivered to a steward who did survive were a message to his wife. "Tell her I played the game out straight to the end. No woman shall be left aboard this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward." The theatrical quality of this gesture should not obscure the genuine courage it represented. the choice to face death with dignity, to use the final moments to craft a legacy of honor even as the world fell apart around them. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, moved through the vessel as it sank, urging passengers to put on life jackets and get to the lifeboats, his face reportedly showing the agony of a man watching his creation kill the people it was supposed to protect. Witnesses last saw him in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting alone with his thoughts, having apparently given up any attempt to save himself, perhaps unable to bear the idea of surviving when so many would die because of flaws in a design he had helped create. Captain Smith remained on the bridge as the ship sank, his exact final moments unknown, though he was reportedly seen helping to free a collapsible lifeboat before the water swept him away. He followed the ancient maritime tradition that a captain is responsible for his ship and its passengers, that he should be the last to leave, that his duty extends to the final moment. Whether this tradition serves any practical purpose is debatable, but it speaks to a particular conception of honor and responsibility that placed duty above personal survival. The musicians, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley, continued playing as the ship sank, providing music that helped maintain calm and gave comfort to those who had no hope of survival. The exact final song they played has been debated. Some survivors reported it was Nearer My God to Thee, others claimed it was Autumn. But what matters is not the specific tune, but the choice to keep playing, to use their skills in service of something larger than themselves, to provide beauty and solace in the final minutes of life. Hartley had reportedly told a friend before the voyage that if he were ever on a sinking ship, he would keep the band playing to the end, and he kept that promise, creating one of the most enduring images of heroism from the disaster. But courage was not limited to the famous or the wealthy. All through the ship, ordinary crew members made choices that prioritized passenger safety over their own survival. Stewards continued guiding passengers even when it meant missing their own chances at the boats. Engineers stayed at their posts, keeping the lights and power running, working in spaces that were flooding, giving their lives to provide a few more minutes of light and warmth for those above. Firemen and stokers worked to the end, knowing that maintaining steam pressure meant they would not have time to reach the deck before the ship went down. And there were other kinds of courage, less celebrated but equally real. The courage of women who agreed to board lifeboats and leave behind their husbands, accepting survival with the knowledge that it meant widowhood, that the rest of their lives would be shadowed by this night. The courage of crew members who rowed boats away from the ship despite the desperate cries of people in the water, knowing that attempting rescue would mean swamping the boats and killing everyone, making the terrible calculation that some lives must be sacrificed to save others. The courage of passengers who gave their life jackets to others who had none, who stepped back from boats to allow someone else to board, who helped strangers when helping meant reducing their own chances of survival. There were also failures of courage, decisions driven by fear and self-preservation that resulted in lifeboats being launched half-empty, in men who disguised themselves as women to gain entry to boats, in panic and chaos that cost lives. These failures are part of the story too, a reminder that human beings under extreme stress do not always behave nobly, that survival instinct can overwhelm moral principles, that courage is not universal but individual, a choice that each person must make for themselves in the moment. The evacuation of the Titanic would ultimately save about 700 people while more than 1,500 died, a ratio that was determined partly by the inadequate number of lifeboats, partly by the organisation and discipline of the crew during the evacuation, partly by the accidents of where people were located on the ship and how quickly they understood the danger, and partly by the choices that individuals made in moments of crisis. Those who survived owed their lives to a combination of circumstance and decision, their own choices and the choices of others, luck and sacrifice intertwined in ways that would be impossible to fully untangle. And for those who found themselves with no possibility of survival, who stood on the slanting decks as the water rose and the bow disappeared and the stern lifted higher into the air, who faced the certainty of death by drowning or by cold in the next few minutes, the final acts of courage were simply about how to face that death, with dignity or with despair, alone or with others, in prayer or in silence, with thoughts of loved ones or with minds blank from fear. These were private deaths, experienced individually even in the midst of crowds, and we can only imagine what passed through the minds of those final moments, what fears and regrets and hopes occupied the thoughts of people who had boarded a ship less than a week earlier, with no idea that they were beginning the last journey of their lives. The lifeboats, as they pulled away from the sinking ship, carried with them the living remnants of what had been a community. Passengers and crew members crowded into small boats designed for rowing, inadequately supplied with blankets or food or water, drifting on an ocean that was calm but bitterly cold under a sky blazing with indifferent stars. The separation between those in the boats and those still on the ship was not just physical but existential. Those in the boats had been granted life, however uncertain and uncomfortable, while those on the ship were left with only minutes before the ocean claimed them. In the boats, survivors watched the Titanic with a mixture of horror and disbelief, still struggling to accept that what was happening was real. The ship remained lit, its lights glowing against the darkness, creating an almost festive appearance that seemed grotesquely inappropriate to the catastrophe unfolding. From the boats, passengers could see figures still on deck, could hear sounds carrying across the water, could watch as the bow sank deeper and the stern rose higher, as the angle of the deck became steeper and standing became impossible. Some in the boats wanted to row back to pick up more people, understanding that there was space in many boats that had been launched partially empty, but they were overruled by crew members or by other passengers who feared that approaching the ship would result in the boats being swamped by desperate swimmers, that attempting rescue would only add to the death toll. The people still aboard the Titanic were facing their final minutes with whatever courage and dignity they could muster. Some prayed, individually or in groups, seeking comfort in faith and the hope of an afterlife. Some continued their work, crew members performing their duties to the end, because duty was what gave structure and meaning to their lives. Some gathered together, finding solace in companionship, unwilling to die alone. Some jumped into the water before the ship went down, hoping perhaps to swim to a lifeboat or simply choosing to end it quickly, rather than waiting for the ship to pull them under. These choices, made in extremity, reveal something essential about human nature: the desire for agency, even in situations where control has been lost, the need to make decisions about how to face death, even when death itself is inevitable. At approximately 2:20 in the morning, more than 2.5 hours after the collision, the RMS Titanic reached the limit of its ability to float. The forward sections were completely flooded, the weight pulling the bow down so steeply that the stern lifted entirely out of the water, propellers and rudder visible against the sky, the ship standing almost vertically before the structural integrity failed and the vessel broke apart between the third and fourth funnels. The stern section, briefly relieved of the weight of the flooded bow, settled back somewhat before it too began its final descent, the ocean pouring into the open wound where the ship had broken, pulling the stern down quickly. Survivors in the lifeboats reported hearing a tremendous roaring sound as the ship made its final plunge, a combination of water rushing into the hull and objects breaking loose, and the death agony of a structure never designed to stand vertically. And then the lights, which had remained onto the end maintained by engineers who died at their posts, finally went out, and the ship disappeared beneath the surface, leaving behind only wreckage and debris and hundreds of people struggling in water so cold that death would come within minutes for most of them. The cries of those in the water were reported by every survivor as the worst part of the experience, worse than watching the ship sink, worse than the cold and the fear and the grief. Hundreds of voices calling for help, screaming, praying, the sound carrying across the calm water to the lifeboats that sat with empty seats, with capacity to save perhaps 100 more people if they had been willing to return. But they did not return, except for one boat that eventually went back and pulled a handful of swimmers from the water, finding most already dead, the cold having stopped their hearts within 20 minutes of entering the water. The rest of the boats sat and listened as the voices gradually diminished, as one by one the cries ceased, as the ocean claimed its victims and left only silence broken by the sound of water lapping against the sides of the lifeboats. The survivors, mostly women and children, plus a smaller number of men who'd been crew members or who had found spaces in boats through various combinations of circumstance and choice, drifted through the rest of the night, cold and wet and traumatized, some still not fully believing what had happened, others already deep in grief and shock. They waited for rescue that they hoped would come, though they had no certainty of it, no way of knowing whether the wireless messages that had been sent before the ship sank had been received, whether any ships were coming to their aid, how long they might have to survive in the lifeboats before help arrived, or before they too succumbed to cold and exposure. And far below them, settling through more than 2 miles of black water, the wreckage of the RMS Titanic fell toward the ocean floor, carrying with it the bodies of more than 1,500 people, all the dreams and plans and hopes that had been loaded aboard in Southampton and Cherbourg and Queenstown, all the letters and possessions and artifacts of lives that had been lived and were now ended. The ship would continue falling for hours before reaching the bottom, landing in the utter darkness of the deep ocean, in a world without light or warmth, where it would remain undiscovered for more than 70 years, a monument and a tomb, a physical reminder of the night when human confidence encountered the limits of human control and lost. The rescue came with the dawn, the arrival marking a transition from the nightmare of the dark hours to a new reality that would be no less painful but at least offered the possibility of survival. The steamship Carpathia, commanded by Captain Arthur Rostron, had received the Titanic's distress calls and had immediately turned toward the reported position, pushing his ship beyond its normal speed, racing through ice-filled waters that were dangerous precisely because of the disaster he was trying to respond to. The Carpathia arrived at the scene around 4 a.m, just as the sky was beginning to lighten, revealing a scene of desolation, icebergs scattered across a calm sea, debris floating on the surface, and the lifeboats, small and fragile-looking, spread across an area of several miles. The process of recovering survivors took hours, the lifeboats rowing to the Carpathia one by one, passengers climbing rope ladders or being hoisted aboard in slings if they were too weak or injured to climb on their own. The crew of the Carpathia worked with compassion and efficiency, helping passengers aboard, providing blankets and hot drinks, trying to offer comfort to people who were physically and emotionally broken by what they had endured. Passengers who had been aboard the Carpathia on its original voyage gave up their cabins to survivors, shared their clothes, did what they could to help even though nothing could really address the scale of trauma that had been experienced. As survivors came aboard, the reality of the losses began to become clear. Families were torn apart, women discovering that husbands had not survived, children orphaned, siblings separated. The manifest of survivors was posted, people scanning desperately for names of loved ones, the absence of a name being the first terrible confirmation that hope was gone, that people who had been alive and well just hours before were now dead, somewhere beneath the cold Atlantic. The demographics of survival told their own story about class and inequality. Most of the women and children from first class had survived. A smaller but still substantial percentage from second class, and a tragically low number from third class where more than half the passengers had died, including a heartbreaking number of children who had never made it to the lifeboats or who'd been left behind when their parents could not navigate the barriers and locked gates that separated third class from the boat deck. The crew of the Titanic who survived, mostly those who'd been assigned to man the lifeboats, found themselves in a complicated position, alive when so many of their colleagues had died, including many senior officers and most of the engineering staff who had stayed below maintaining power until the end. They faced questions both from survivors and from themselves about what more could have been done, about whether the evacuation had been handled properly, about the decisions that had been made in the chaos of the sinking. These questions would be asked formally in the inquiries that would follow, but they were also questions that would haunt many crew members for the rest of their lives, a burden of survivors' guilt and professional responsibility that no amount of investigation or exoneration could fully address. Among the survivors was J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, who'd been aboard for the maiden voyage and who had made the decision to board a lifeboat when the ship was clearly doomed and no women or children were immediately available. His survival would become controversial, leading to accusations of cowardice, suggestions that as a company official he should have gone down with the ship, criticisms that ignored the fact that his boarding the lifeboat broke no written or unwritten rule, but that nevertheless judged him by a standard of masculine honour that demanded self-sacrifice. Ismay would spend the rest of his life shadowed by the disaster, eventually retiring from public life, reportedly haunted by what had happened and by the judgment he faced for having survived. Also among the survivors was Margaret Brown, who had become famous as the unsinkable Molly Brown for her actions in the lifeboat, where she helped row and encouraged the others and argued for returning to pick up survivors from the water, becoming in the popular imagination a symbol of courage and resourcefulness. Her story would be simplified and romanticized over the years, but the core truth remained. She had acted with compassion and strength in crisis, had used her position and personality to help others, had demonstrated that heroism was not the exclusive property of men or of those born to privilege. The survivors also included Harold Bride, the wireless operator who had continued sending distress signals until the water was pouring into his working space, who had somehow survived the sinking and been pulled into a collapsible boat, and who would within days of the rescue give interviews describing the final moments of the ship, becoming one of the first sources of information about what had happened during those terrible hours. His testimony, along with that of other survivors, would begin to construct the narrative of the disaster, a narrative that would be contested and revised and analysed, but that would form the basis for how the sinking would be understood and remembered. As the Carpathia made its way toward New York, a voyage that would take several days, survivors began the process of trying to make sense of what had happened to them. Some found comfort in the company of others who had shared the experience, forming bonds that would last for the rest of their lives, united by the trauma they had endured. Others retreated into themselves, unable or unwilling to talk about what they had seen and experienced, preferring silence to the pain of remembering. Many wrote letters to families, breaking the news of deaths, trying to explain what had happened while still not fully understanding it themselves. The letters were grief-stricken and confused, trying to capture something that seemed beyond words, trying to communicate loss on a scale that resisted comprehension. The survivors arriving in New York would face a world that was hungry for information, that wanted to understand how such a disaster could have happened to the supposedly unsinkable ship. that was eager to assign blame and demand accountability and find some way to make sense of a tragedy that seemed senseless. They would face inquiries and interviews, their testimonies becoming part of the official record, their memories preserved in transcripts and reports. They would face the practical challenges of rebuilding their lives. Widows who had suddenly become solely responsible for supporting families, orphaned children who would need to be cared for, immigrants who had lost everything, including family members, and who would have to decide whether to continue with their plans for a new life in America or try to return to the countries they had left behind. And they would carry with them for the rest of their lives the memories of that night, the sound of the ship breaking apart, the cries of those in the water, the feeling of helplessness in the lifeboats, the face of a husband or father or child last seen standing on the deck waving goodbye, the knowledge that they had survived when so many others had not. This knowledge, this burden of memory and survival would shape their remaining years in ways both obvious and subtle, making them permanent witnesses to history, living reminders of a disaster that would continue to fascinate and horrify generations yet unborn. The news of the Titanic's sinking reached the world in fragments, transmitted by wireless from the Carpathia, picked up by shore stations, disseminated by newspapers that published extra editions as information became available. The initial reports were confused, some claiming all passengers had been saved, others suggesting the ship was still afloat being towed to port. Optimistic misinformation that gave false hope to families waiting for news before the full truth emerged. The Titanic had sunk. More than 1,500 people were dead. The greatest maritime disaster in peacetime history had occurred. The shock was profound, not just because of the scale of the loss, but because of what the disaster represented: the failure of technology, the exposure of human hubris, the reminder that for all the progress and confidence of the modern age, nature and chance could still overwhelm human plans and render meaningless all assurances of safety and control. In the days and weeks following the disaster, the world grappled with trying to understand what had happened and what it meant. Newspapers published long lists of the dead, hundreds of names arranged by class and nationality, each representing a life ended and a family plunged into grief. In cities and towns across Britain and America and Ireland and Sweden and Syria and all the other places that had sent passengers aboard the Titanic, families waited for news that would either confirm their worst fears or provide the miraculous relief of learning that their loved one had survived. Crowds gathered at the offices of the White Star Line and outside the newspapers, desperate for information, clinging to hope, even as the growing lists of the dead made hope increasingly untenable. The bodies of those who had died were scattered across the Atlantic, some trapped inside the sunken ship, others floating on the surface or drifting just below it. A recovery effort was mounted, ships sent from Halifax to collect the dead, recovering more than 300 bodies over the course of several weeks. Each body was examined, personal effects were catalogued, attempts were made to identify the dead so that families could have some certainty and some closure. First-class passengers whose bodies were recovered were generally embalmed and shipped to their families for burial. Second-class and crew members were often buried at sea or in Halifax cemeteries. Third-class passengers, particularly those who could not be identified, received the least consideration, their bodies often buried at sea without ceremony, their families sometimes never learning for certain whether their loved one had been among those recovered or was still at the bottom of the ocean, forever lost. The funeral services held in cities around the world were occasions of mass mourning, thousands of people gathering to honour the dead, to express communal grief, to try to find some meaning in loss that seemed overwhelming. Churches held memorial services, Eulogies were delivered, hymns were sung, including "Nearer, My God, to Thee," which became associated with the disaster because of the belief that it had been the last song played by the ship's musicians. The disaster united people in grief across boundaries of class and nation, creating a shared sense of loss that transcended the individual tragedies, a recognition that something important had been taken from the world when the Titanic sank and took so many lives with it. But even as the world mourned, questions were being asked that demanded answers. How could this have happened? Who was responsible? What failures of judgment or design or regulation had allowed a brand new ship on its maiden voyage to sink with such catastrophic loss of life? These questions led to formal investigations, first by the United States Senate and then by a British Board of Trade inquiry, both seeking to establish the facts of the disaster and to assign accountability. The testimonies of survivors, particularly crew members and officers, were examined in detail, creating an official record of the disaster that has formed the basis for historical understanding ever since. The inquiries revealed a cascade of failures and mistakes that had contributed to the disaster. The inadequate number of lifeboats, a result of outdated regulations and company decisions that prioritized deck space over safety. The excessive speed despite ice warnings, reflecting a culture in the shipping industry that valued maintaining schedule and demonstrating speed over cautious navigation. The failure of the wireless operators to ensure that all ice warnings reached the bridge in a timely manner, a consequence of the prioritization of commercial message traffic over navigational information. The lack of adequate training and drills for crew members, leaving them unprepared to manage an evacuation efficiently. The design of the ship itself, with watertight compartments that were not actually watertight because they did not extend high enough to prevent water from spilling over from one compartment to the next as the ship tilted. But beyond these technical failures, the disaster revealed something deeper about the society that had created the Titanic. It exposed the class divisions that meant third-class passengers were both literally and figuratively below first-class passengers, separated by locked gates and social assumptions that some lives were more valuable than others. It challenged the faith in technology and progress that had characterized the early 20th century, demonstrating that human ingenuity could create marvels but could not guarantee safety, that every achievement carried within it the possibility of catastrophic failure. It raised questions about the responsibilities of corporations and the adequacy of government regulation, about whether profit motives could be trusted to balance against safety concerns, or whether stronger oversight was necessary. The immediate result of the disaster was a series of reforms aimed at preventing such a tragedy from recurring. International regulations were revised to require ships to carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. Ice patrol services were established to monitor and report on iceberg locations in the North Atlantic. Wireless communication protocols were changed to ensure that distress calls would be monitored around the clock. Ships were required to conduct regular lifeboat drills so that crew and passengers would know what to do in an emergency. These changes, mandated by the loss of the Titanic, have undoubtedly saved countless lives in the decades since, a legacy of the disaster that offers at least some meaning to the loss, some assurance that the deaths were not entirely in vain. But for the families of those who died, no amount of regulatory reform could fill the void left by loss. Widows struggled to support themselves and their children, particularly those from working-class backgrounds who had relied on husbands' wages and who now faced poverty as well as grief. Children grew up without fathers, carrying always the shadow of the disaster, knowing that their lives had been shaped by an event they were too young to remember, or that they had experienced in ways they could never fully process or articulate. Elderly parents lost adult children who'd been their support, facing old age alone and bereaved. The ripples of loss spread outward from each death, affecting families and communities and creating absences that would be felt for generations. Among the dead were entire families who had been travelling together. The Sage family, all 9 members lost, from the parents to the infant, their names appearing together on the memorial lists, a tragedy contained and complete. The Goodwin family, 8 people similarly lost in their entirety, leaving relatives back home to mourn multiple deaths from a single disaster. Individual deaths were tragic, but these family losses seemed almost incomprehensible. Entire branches of family trees cut off, futures erased, the weight of loss multiplied by the number of people mourning. There were also the orphans created by the disaster, children who survived but whose parents did not, or children left behind when parents died. The most famous were the Navratil children, 2 young boys whose father had been fleeing a custody dispute, travelling under an assumed name with his sons. He placed them in a lifeboat but did not survive himself, and the boys arrived in New York unable to speak much English, without any identification, becoming international news as authorities tried to determine who they were and find their remaining family. Stories like theirs captured public attention, providing individual human narratives within the larger tragedy, faces and names that personalize the abstract numbers of the dead and missing. The disaster also created a strange kind of celebrity for some survivors, their names becoming known because of their connection to the tragedy. Some, like Margaret Brown and Lawrence Beasley, wrote accounts of their experiences, contributing to the historical record and also to their own fame or notoriety. Others found themselves defined by the disaster despite wanting only to forget and move on, their identity forever linked to that one night, their experiences becoming public property to be examined and questioned and judged. The burden of survival included this loss of privacy, this transformation from ordinary person into historical figure, witness to events that the world wanted desperately to understand. And always, in all the grief and all the questioning and all the attempts to memorialize and make meaning, there was the absent ship itself, the wreckage lying at the bottom of the Atlantic, physically present but utterly inaccessible, a tomb and a monument that no one could visit or see. The Titanic's location was unknown for decades, the subject of speculation and failed search attempts, its exact position on the ocean floor remaining a mystery. This inaccessibility added to the ship's mythic quality, making it more legend than reality, a story told and retold, but always with the core of it remaining hidden in darkness 2 miles below the surface of the ocean. In time, as the years passed and the immediate grief receded into memory, the Titanic disaster began its transformation from current event to history, from lived experience to cultural artifact. The survivors aged and eventually died, taking with them their first-hand memories, leaving behind only their recorded testimonies and the physical objects they had salvaged, life jackets and deck chairs, pieces of china and silverware, letters written before the sinking or after the rescue, photographs taken during the voyage or in the aftermath. These objects became relics, displayed in museums, treated with the reverence given to artifacts from important historical events, evidence that the disaster had really happened, that it was not just story but truth. The names of the dead were carved into memorials in cities around the world, in Southampton where so many of the crew had lived, in Belfast where the ship had been built, in New York where the survivors had arrived, in small towns and villages that sent even one passenger or crew member aboard. These memorials preserved the names, ensured that the dead would not be entirely forgotten, provided places where families and later descendants could come to mourn and to remember. The inscription spoke of sacrifice and courage, of tragedy and loss, trying to find words adequate to the magnitude of what had occurred, and generally failing because no words could truly capture the human dimension of 1,500 individual deaths, each one representing a consciousness extinguished, a story ended, an absence that would be felt by those who loved them for the rest of their lives. Over the decades, the Titanic would inspire countless books and films and songs, each generation retelling the story in ways that reflected their own concerns and values. Sometimes the focus was on the romance of first-class passengers, sometimes on the heroism of the crew, sometimes on the class inequalities that shaped survival, sometimes on the technical details of the sinking. The story proved endlessly adaptable, capable of supporting different interpretations and emphases, a narrative flexible enough to serve as metaphor for human hubris, for technological failure, for class struggle, for individual courage, for the power of love, for the indifference of fate. The real people aboard the ship were gradually transformed into characters in these retellings, their complexities reduced to fit the needs of narrative, their actual lives less important than the symbolic roles they came to play in the cultural memory of the disaster. But beneath all the myth-making and all the cultural appropriation of the disaster, the fundamental human truth remained. The Titanic had been filled with real people who had boarded with hopes and plans, and no idea that they were beginning a voyage that would end in catastrophe. They were not characters in a story, but individuals who had lived and who had died, whose final hours involved fear and cold and the knowledge that death was approaching, whose experiences deserved to be remembered not as entertainment or as cautionary tale, but as actual human suffering and courage and loss. The great ship that had seemed unsinkable proved to be mortal after all, vulnerable to a chance encounter with ice, brought down not by any single catastrophic failure, but by a combination of small mistakes and misjudgments and design flaws that accumulated into disaster. And the people aboard learned in the most terrible way possible that confidence can be misplaced, that safety is never guaranteed, that the universe does not arrange itself according to human plans or human notions of what should happen. They learned that death can come suddenly and unfairly, that it takes children and the elderly, the brave and the cowardly, the wealthy and the poor, without discrimination and without mercy. And those who survived learned that guilt can be as heavy as grief, that living when others died can feel like a burden rather than a gift, that some experiences mark a person forever, creating a before and after that divides life into incompatible chapters. The question of why the Titanic continues to fascinate more than a century after it sank is complex, but part of the answer lies in the fact that it was not just a disaster, but a story about people, about choices and consequences, about technology and nature, about class and inequality, about courage and cowardice, about love and loss, all the fundamental themes of human existence concentrated into a single event that unfolded over a few hours on a cold April night in the middle of the ocean. The disaster was both specific, tied to a particular time and place and ship, and universal, speaking to fears and concerns that transcend the early 20th century, that remain relevant in any age when human beings trust in technology and systems that might fail them. The Titanic has become a kind of cultural touchstone, a shared reference point that requires no explanation, a shorthand for hubris and downfall, for tragedy that seemed preventable in hindsight but that at the time seemed impossible to imagine. When people describe something as rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, they invoke the disaster as metaphor for futile activity in the face of catastrophe. When new ships or projects are described as unsinkable, the ghost of the Titanic looms as a reminder of why such confidence is dangerous. The disaster has entered the language, become part of the collective unconscious of Western culture, a story that everyone knows at least in outline, that has been told so many times it has taken on the quality of myth. But myths, for all their power, can obscure the human reality they are based on. The mythical Titanic is a symbol, a metaphor, a cautionary tale. The real Titanic was a ship full of people who were cold and scared and trying to survive, who made choices under pressure that they had never anticipated facing, who showed both the best and worst of human nature in circumstances that tested them to their limits. To honor their memory requires looking past the myth to the reality, to the individual lives that were lived and lost, to the specific circumstances and decisions that led to the disaster, to the grief of those left behind to mourn. The passengers and crew of the RMS Titanic deserve to be remembered not as a collective tragedy, a number in a historical account, but as individuals who each had a story worth knowing, a life that mattered to someone, a death that left a hole in the world. They deserve to be more than names on a memorial or characters in a movie. They were human beings who lived in a specific moment in history, who made the decision or had the misfortune to board a particular ship on a particular voyage, whose lives were cut short or forever altered by what happened during 5 days in April 1912. And so we remember them, or try to, across the vast distance of time that separates our world from theirs. We read their letters and study their photographs and reconstruct their experiences from the testimonies of survivors and the records that survived. We visit the memorials and the museums, look at the artifacts that were salvaged, watch the films and read the books that keep their story alive. We do this partly out of curiosity, partly out of a desire to understand, partly out of the recognition that their story is also in some way our story, that we too are vulnerable, that we too trust in technologies and systems that might fail us, that we too could find ourselves in circumstances that test whether we will act with courage or cowardice, with selfishness or sacrifice. The lessons of the Titanic are both specific and universal. Specifically, the disaster led to reforms that have made ocean travel safer, that have saved lives in the decades since. Universally, it reminds us of our mortality, of the fragility of human achievement, of the importance of humility in the face of forces we cannot control. It teaches us that class and wealth do not protect against disaster, though they may offer advantages in survival. It shows us that courage can be found in unexpected places, that ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances can act with heroism. It demonstrates that the choices we make matter, that individual decisions can mean the difference between life and death for ourselves and others. But perhaps the most important lesson is simply to remember, to honor the dead by not forgetting them, by ensuring that their names and their stories continue to be told, by recognizing them as the complex human beings they were, rather than reducing them to statistics or symbols. Every person who boarded the Titanic brought with them the accumulation of a lifetime of experiences, a unique perspective, a consciousness that was valuable and irreplaceable. When they died, the world lost not just a life, but all the possibilities that life contained. The children they might have had, the work they might have done, the love they might have given and received. These losses ripple forward through time, creating absences that can never be filled, futures that were erased before they could unfold. More than a century has passed since that April night when the Titanic sank. Everyone who was aboard is now dead, not just those who died in the disaster, but those who survived it, who carried their memories and their trauma through the rest of the 20th century before age and time claimed them as well. The world they knew, the world of 1912 with its particular social arrangements and technologies and assumptions, is as dead as they are, transformed by 2 world wars and a century of change into something they would barely recognize. The Titanic that exists now is not the ship they knew, but a wreck on the ocean floor, slowly deteriorating, soon to collapse entirely into rust and memory. And yet their story endures, passed down through generations, kept alive by the accounts they left and by our continued fascination with what happened to them. They speak to us across time, these passengers and crew of the Titanic, their voices preserved in letters and testimonies, their images captured in photographs taken before the disaster, their names carved into memorials that will outlast us all. They remind us of what it means to be human, to hope and fear, to love and lose, to face death with whatever courage we can muster, to live lives that matter even if they are cut short, even if they are forgotten by all but a few who bothered to learn their names and understand their stories. And with that, dear listener, we reach the end of tonight's journey through the lives and stories of those aboard the RMS Titanic. We have walked the decks with them, read their letters, followed them from the excitement of boarding through the routines of the voyage to the final terrible hours when the ship sank and took so many with it. We have tried to see them not as victims or heroes or symbols, but as people, complex and contradictory, brave and frightened, ordinary individuals caught up in extraordinary circumstances. Their story is not just about a ship that sank, but about humanity in all its diversity and commonality, about the threads that connect us across time and class and circumstance, about what it means to live and hope and dream and die. May their memory be a blessing and a reminder. May we honour them by remembering their names and their stories. May we learn from their tragedy without exploiting it. May we find meaning in their loss without diminishing their suffering. And may we carry forward the knowledge that every life is precious, that every person has a story worth knowing, that beneath all the historical narratives and cultural myths are individual human beings who loved and were loved, who mattered to someone, whose absence left holes in the world that have never been filled. Close your eyes now. Let their voices fade into the gentle darkness of sleep. Let their story rest alongside all the other stories of human joy and sorrow that make up the vast tapestry of history. The echoes of that April night still sound across more than a century, still call to us to remember, still remind us of our shared fragility and our shared humanity. But for now, let them fade. Let peace come. Let the ocean cover over the wreckage and the memory both, gentle and final and complete. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest undisturbed, your tomorrow blessed with the knowledge that you are alive in a world where stories like this one can be told and heard and remembered. The past is gone, but it lives in memory. The dead are beyond our reach, but they speak to us still. And the lessons of history, if we are willing to learn them, can guide us toward a future that honours the sacrifices and the suffering of all those who came before. May it bring you peace, calm and gentle dreams.